Hello, and welcome back to What Now on the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. And I'm here with my friends and colleagues and my co-hosts,
David Kennedy,
Brett Keating,
and I'm Julie Brown. And for this episode, this is a really special and unique episode because we are here with a whole family tonight, the Birrell family, and David's going to introduce you to them, and I'll let you take it away, David.
Thanks, Julie. And I'm so excited to have the Birrell family, who I consider to be very good friends of my wife and I. And we have journeyed and been with this family through thick and thin, I suppose we could say, but I have come to love and appreciate each one of them. And we're delighted that three out of the four are able to join us. Syd and his wife Pam, or I should say Pam and her husband Syd. And then we have Rebecca, their daughter, who is here with us tonight. And Benjamin, is in Guyana in Africa right now. So he is in the middle of the night and unable to join us on this podcast. But perhaps we'll catch up with him later and add some things into our discussion tonight. So I'm so grateful to have the Birrell family with us tonight. And what holds us all together is James. And James is their son, and he is this person who has just made such an incredible difference in so many ways in people's lives, both in his living and in his dying, has contributed amazing work into our world and the world of sick kids and everything else that goes along with that. But I think it would be helpful if we could kind of understand and get to know James a little bit, or a little bit of his story and what happened in his life that created this unimaginable event, and then life that happens after that. But let's begin with James, and maybe Syd, you could help us understand the story of this wonderful boy.
We were a normal family, so we had three little kids, a baby age 10 months old, and then James age 2 and Rebecca age 3. It was insanity, as it always is when you got all these little kids and the chaos that goes with it. And we were pretty normal. Here we are living in a small town in Canada, in Peterborough, Ontario, not too far from Toronto, in our little community where we had tons of friends and support. But then Pam, age 32, with a 10-month-old, was diagnosed with breast cancer. This was aggressive, it was really serious, and she was not expected to survive. 9 months later, she's been through surgery and chemotherapy, and we think we're just catching our breath. But our middle child is frequently ill, and it was thought that he was worried about his mom, so no one was too concerned. And just as Pam was getting better and her hair starting to grow again, then we found out that James wasn't just worried about his mom. He had a vicious cancer called neuroblastoma. That's a cancer of the nervous system. He was diagnosed just shy of 4 years in age, and immediately very aggressive treatment was started. So for the next 4 years, half of James's life, he was fighting cancer. And this is the story of how this all unfolded. At the time, the internet was just getting going, emails were just happening, and I'd send out little reports on what happened today. Otherwise, you would be pestered by 100 people phoning to say, what happened today, how's it going, all that. So we started doing emails, sending out news about how it was going, and these were forwarded by everyone to everyone else on their email list, unknown to us, until we started getting replies from around the world. So inadvertently, out of that came a book, but really it was just a bunch of emails and probably a survival technique for me. How do I get through this? I can't sleep in the middle of the night. I'd write an email about how it went that day. And that built around us this incredible support network, which is unusual. We weren't looking for it, but that's just the way it happened. And sometimes James was feeling pretty good. For a part of that time, he was in remission, but then the disease came back, and that's when they told us, sorry, this is going to be the worst day of your life. here's the news: this your son is not going to make it, and it's really difficult for us to tell us. And we can give you maybe 1 year, but not 2 years. As a matter of fact, James carved out 26 months of extraordinary living during that time. And I choose the word living because somehow that's what we learned to do, was how to seize the day. The title of the book was one of James's little sayings. He was just full of wise little ideas, all wrapped in humor. And it was after a really nasty day of tests. The sick kids finally were at home, and I'm cuddled up. It happened to be my turn to sleep with him. And I just said, James, how do you put up with all this? This is really pretty rough, isn't it? He said, well, you can't let cancer ruin your day. Just came out. So that was the title of the book. It couldn't have been better than that. So we learned to deal with the ups and downs, and we were really pushing hard to find quality of life. If you know you don't have long to live, you make certain plans and you get philosophical. When you know your kid doesn't have long to live, the challenge is far greater. And you have to decide, how much treatment are we going to give? Shall we do another round of chemo? Should we try some last ditch thing? Should we do another blood transfusion? Or would this be an easy way to let him go? Just don't do the blood transfusion. Very difficult questions all the time. And meanwhile, there is Rebecca and Ben, and we're desperately trying to let them know that they are equally as important as James, but sorry, we're often away at sick kids while unknown nanny or helper is babysitting them. Again, a very difficult time for them. And as we found out later, that leaves deep scars on the siblings of cancer kids because they grow up being just in the way and forgotten when in fact they're not. And that takes very long. Rebecca will speak to that. Along the way, we were challenged by a doctor who I was having a late night conversation with him, and he said, you know, leukemia, we used to be 85% death rate, and now it's 85% survival. What happened? We just threw a ton of money at it. And that's what needs to happen for neuroblastoma. And faced with this, he's going to die. One of the things that we did was to talk to sick kids about stimulating some research. So we started the James Fund. And the James Fund took off in an unexpected way. It just became meteoric, and we raised a lot of money and stimulated a lot of research. So the James Fund became part of our life. And at the same time, we were brushing shoulders with all kinds of celebrities. I know Tom Hanks is the big deal one, and he just called our house one day and said, I'd like to speak to James. Through some complex sequence of connections, he'd heard about James and his love for the movie Apollo 13, and he just wanted to call James. So he became a good friend of the family, supporting us, sending us gifts, cards, and then he became the patron of the James Fund. Like, what is that? What kind of gift is that? He's your honorary patron, and all of a sudden you've got visibility and exposure like crazy, which really helped the research and so forth. So that's the background. And he died in 2001 in appalling pain as neuroblastoma. They call it intractable pain. That's pain that the only way you can deal with it is to put you into a coma because nothing else is going to help. So there he is in our family room and huddled in his little position that he was for 2 weeks as he's dying. And you couldn't touch him. You couldn't comfort him by holding his hand. That was far too painful. And he died in our home. But even in that period, he came out with extraordinary things like, Dad, I've been thinking every day is a precious gift. You got to use every day. So this is coming from a boy who's days away from death. That's kind of the level of extraordinary things that were going on. He died, and we buried him, and then we tried to make sense of it. And I can tell you, there is nothing like losing a child. All of you in the grief work know it's just the most appalling thing. 23 years later, the intensity and the frequency of these grief attacks are much less, but you just gotta peel away one thing and you're in full-blown tears. You learn to live with this mammoth hole in your heart. But I hate it when people say, Oh, it'll transition into a lovely warm glow as you think about James in heaven with Jesus, and you'll just be filled with a warm, wonderful. Well, that is shit. That really is not what happens. And I'm so angry when people write books
Yeah.
about, oh, your son is in heaven. You must be so happy now, aren't you? That kind of thing. Well, I think I've said enough, including a bad word. So away you go.
Well, you're not the first to do that, Sid, so it's good. But I was going to say, yeah, the rawness. I remember a time when we were out on your brother's pontoon boat one morning, and you had just passed the $1 million mark in the James Fund. And I remember sitting there eating cereal with you, watching the sun come up, and we were talking about that, and you said, I would give it all back if I could have James. And of course you would. And I think that's the intensity, and we can certainly appreciate that from just listening to you here. Let me just move that over a little bit to Rebecca, and as a as a sibling, what do you remember about that time leading up until James' death? What do you remember about that?
I mean, I still remember everything quite vividly. I know my brother Ben doesn't really remember much, and I don't know if that's just differences in our memories or if that's more of a coping mechanism for him, but I still remember things quite vividly. And I mean, I remember the good times as well as the bad times. So I remember the adventures we would go on and the spontaneous trips we would take, and things like going to the set of Zubumafu and getting a behind the scenes tour of that. And even little things like to make IVs not so frightening. We had a whole IV set up in the bathtub. So when the three of us little kids were in the bath, we had this elaborate setup of IVs that we would play with in the bath. We played a lot as kids, and I think James's illness sometimes made that hard. We played a lot in hospitals, on hospital beds. I mean, as a 6-year-old, you can have endless hours of fun with a hospital bed that automatically goes up and down. But then I do remember at the end of James's life when he couldn't be touched, and you couldn't even touch the bed because that would cause him horrific pain or nausea, and not understanding that at all as a kid. And kids understand more than people give them credit for, but there's still things that you don't really comprehend at the time. You don't really understand fully why you can't touch your brother right now. You don't understand the level of pain he's in because you've never experienced anything like that, and you just don't have the frame of reference. I remember a lot, and it definitely shaped quite a lot of my life after.
Okay, thank you. And that's where we want to get to too. Just one more, Pam. Tell us what you remember right after James died. What did you experience in that moment as a mom?
I think the biggest thing that I felt was relief that he was no longer in pain. When you're a parent, you're supposed to solve your child's problems. When your child is dying of cancer, you can't solve their problems. You can't fix their pain. And relief was the biggest initial emotion, which was quite surprising at the time. I think the waves of devastation started to eclipse that fairly quickly. But I think in that initial feeling was, thank goodness he's not in pain anymore.
Seems to me that the relief makes a lot of sense to me, because that just speaks to the enormity of the suffering that you were witnessing.
Yes. Yes.
Well, and the backdrop of this too is that this is you had your cancer journey the year before the 5 years of James's cancer journey, or 4 years, and,
yes.
And so this was the end of not just 3 years, 4 years. It was the end of a much longer period of time, and you probably weren't realizing what you were carrying through all of that.
Absolutely, absolutely. The enormity of those 5 years, the intensity of it is rather mind-blowing when we look back and we wonder how we survived. And We were carried by many, many, many people who helped. We could never have done it on our own. And then, of course, for me, there's survivor's guilt. Why did I survive and he didn't? We both had very aggressive cancers. We were both not expected to make it. Why am I here? Why is he not? And there is no making sense of so much of this journey. And I think that's psychologically a huge challenge, that we can't sort it. And my family would tell you that I love to sort things. I like to organize things. I like to do puzzles. I like to make it all make sense. And there is no making sense of so much of this journey. We just tried really hard to throw ourselves into Rebecca and Ben's lives. And we felt so cheated for 5 years. We missed out on so much time being spent with them. And I remember us both being very intentional about the time that we could spend with Rebecca and Ben. And I remember going on a class trip with Ben to the Festival of Trees down at the hockey arena. And I was at his side the whole time. And I remember after about an hour, the principal looked at me and he looked around and he said, "You see the difference?" And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Look at the other moms. The other moms are hanging around with each other, chatting and talking. And I was spending the day with Ben. And nothing could take me away from him." So it's a very strange thing. And in the 4 years that James was ill, we spent so much time with him. And it creates just a depth of intensity of emotion and connection that is abnormal. It is an abnormal amount of time to spend with your child. And it just has to be. You don't want your child to be alone in the hospital. And that time that you would normally spend on all of your children and your friends and your family and your career gets funneled into this one person. So it's a very imbalanced thing. And I think we really tried to figure out how to mitigate the neglect that we felt towards Rebecca and Ben. And not that it was intentional, it was just time that we didn't have with them. And I think we really tried to make up for that. Whether or not we were successful, I don't know.
Why don't we ask her?
Yeah, sure.
I think so.
Yeah. Did you feel neglected for that period of time, Rebecca?
I don't remember ever feeling neglected. I mean, being so young, there's times when you miss your family members, especially with so much cancer. Even Ben, who was the youngest, had to get sent away sometimes when he was 6 months old because he had an ear infection and couldn't be around someone going through an immunocompromised cancer treatment. And so I think there was a longing for the family to be together, but there wasn't a feeling of neglect. I think the biggest thing I was jealous of is the fact that James didn't have to go to school most of the time. That was a big source of jealousy for me.
What a kid thing.
Yeah.
Did you then feel smothered afterward?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the term helicopter parents is sort of thrown around a lot these days, but I don't feel that we were smothered or helicopter parented in any way. I think we had a very loving and healthy relationship. I mean, I've had friends before who know our family story say, "Oh gosh, your childhood was so awful." And I'm always taken aback by that. And it's like, I mean, there were a lot of really sucky things that happened, but at the end of the day, I was very loved. And I think that makes a big difference.
Makes all the difference, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Syd, I know, and you've talked a bit about the James Fund, which really is an amazing, and as you say, over 7 million towards this, and Dr. David Kaplan, who became a very good friend of yours and led that research. Looking back at that now, was that a piece of your grief that focusing on that I couldn't save Ben, but I can work on this kind of thing. Do you see that now as some of your grief work?
After James died, yes, very much so. That wasn't apparent to me at the time. I thought that, okay, your kid dies, you got a charity, this is what your family's going to do. That is wrong. And as I watched many other families go through what we've gone through and lose their child, and often they would have their own funds going and raise maybe $50,000 or $100,000 or something to try and help the cure along. I would see a split in the family of one spouse, just, this is what we're doing, right? This is how we honor our son. And for the other person, there was silence, and it was very bad for them. This was not the way they wanted to grieve or to remember their son. And I remember talking with quite a few families and saying, be careful. Make sure that you all want to do this, and it's not one reluctantly coming along. So for me, yeah, it was the right thing. I will tell you about getting connected with some other dads who lost their kids to neuroblastoma, one Canadian and 4 in the States. We formed a group called Sad Dads. That's what we call ourselves. And we would get together. One of the members was pretty wealthy, so he would just set up holidays for us dads. So we'd have Sad Dads get together in New York, on a Caribbean island, and so on. And it was incredibly helpful to be able to share. No one else would understand what we're going through as dads, but 5 other sad dads. Wow, that really was incredible. Yeah, I think James Fund was very helpful to me personally. We met so many wonderful people. And then out of that came a secondary thing, the James Fund Family Retreat. Because it's such a weird disease that nobody knows anything about, you don't know any other families. So we started a retreat at Camp Uchigais. They let us do a weekend retreat once a year. And that retreat thing became very wonderful for very many families who suddenly found, oh, here's someone who understands exactly what's going on. And I remember at the camp, there was a new mom with her baby, toddler, and the toddler was screaming and yelling because he didn't like that ice cream, and he needed to have that ice cream to take his pills. And no. She was frightfully embarrassed, but everyone totally understood that. So I just said, hang around, what is the flavor he wants? And we got it, and that was it. We understood it. This wasn't a spoiled child. This was a kid who has to take some pretty vile kind of medicines every day, and he was used to a certain ice cream. That's the way we totally got it. And that was the environment of that camp, which was so helpful.
What was when Syd talks about the sad dads and how that was really a powerful way to receive some support? Did you have something similar to that, or did something kind of organically grow for you with some people?
I had a group of friends that I was very close to. They were not neuroblastoma moms. They were just longtime friends of mine. And the 4 of us were very close, and they were a big support to me. The other piece for me was I really hadn't dealt with my breast cancer diagnosis. And really that was backburnered for a very long time. And I was diagnosed in 1996. Probably really didn't start to unpack that until 2009, when I joined a breast cancer survivor dragon boat team. So my process was primarily trying to sort out my grief as a mother. And then 13 years later, oh yeah, I got this other thing I need to deal with. And that took on a different form. And the dragon boat thing became a huge part of my life. And it was a place where cancer couldn't get me. I'm in that boat. Cancer can't touch me in that boat. And it was a place where I felt strong and alive and intense. One of the weird feelings after you lose a child is the feeling of being a failure. Your job as a parent is to protect and take care of your kid. And your kid is dead. You've done everything you can, but your brain is still saying, you failed. what if you'd done this? What if you'd gone to a doctor 6 months earlier? What if you'd done this? What if you'd done that? What if you'd fed them more vegetables? What if you'd given them more vitamin D? Those thoughts are endless and they're not rational. They don't make sense, but they don't go away. Feeling like a failure is not a great thing, especially when there isn't the evidence to support it. And there's this constant struggle in your psyche of, I'm a good person, I've worked hard, blah, blah, blah. No, you're a failure, your kid died. So for me, dragon boating was just something where I wasn't a mom, I wasn't a wife, I wasn't a bereaved mom. I was me, I was a cancer survivor. I was with a team that were like me in that regard. And that was a very important piece of my healing journey.
And I think we should just note, congratulations, you just returned from the big dragon boat in Europe, and you won 3 bronze medals, is that correct?
Yes. This was the Club Crew International Regatta in Ravenna, Italy, 7,000 athletes from 50 countries. And this was not a breast cancer competition. This was a hardcore dragon boat. You try out. This is like high school sports teams. Right. You try out, people get cut. It's here, how many times can you bench press half your weight? And it was a big commitment. So yes, I just came home with 3 bronze medals, which was very exciting.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
I was going to ask Rebecca, what was it? Did you worry about your mom and dad's mortality? In other words, were you afraid they might die? Did death enter your family in a way that it created some anxiety for you?
I don't know. I don't remember it. Maybe my parents can answer that better than I can. I don't think it did for me at the time, just because I was old enough that I sort of grasped the concept of James died because he was sick and it's not just a random thing. I remember we had a family friend who had a son who was much younger, and he was close friends with Ben. Ben smashed off one of his fingernails at one point, and this poor little kid was like, is Ben going to die because he smashed his finger? I was older than that, so that wasn't really so much of a concern. But I mean, definitely as I've gotten older and the losses continue and they pile up, I think the concern for all of our mortality definitely increases over time.
You speak, and people can't see you, but I can see you, of course. And there's such a clear closeness and love that's coming through, and that isn't always the case when a child dies. That it can rip families apart. It can create tensions and stresses that are insurmountable. Were there points of tension and stress that you guys really had to work through after James died?
Well, the long term is the puzzling one, and we didn't know this. Part of what James Fund funded over the years was some studies into the long-term effects on the siblings, and that was shocking news because often they quoted a figure high in the 90% that the siblings have huge problems as they move through their teens and as they move towards the 18 years to 22 years or beyond. And I know Rebecca can address us, but we felt we were losing Rebecca for a spell. And then again, Ben, it was suicide watch. He was just switched off, just turned off, and blank expression and so on, and really didn't talk much for a very long time. He has emerged, Rebecca has emerged, and they are extraordinarily strong people as a consequence of fighting their way through that. You sort of think, okay, it's the initial year or 2 or 3 that the kids will be fine after that. But actually, no, it's a lot of problems later. One of the girls from our neuroblastoma family retreat who lost her sister, very similar kind of timing to us, and she was off to first year at university. She told me what it was like. She was finally, I'm out of this, our family's grief. I'm free. I'm at university. I'm at Ottawa. I'm hundreds of kilometers away from everything. And you're in Frosh Week, and the particular thing she mentioned was this game where a basketball was tossed to and fro, and you caught it. And they said, "Okay, what's your finger on?" And it turned out the basketball had all kinds of little questions, icebreakers, fun stuff, like what's your favorite pizza or whatever. And she's having a great time, and she caught it, and the question was, "What do you miss about the summers?" or "What are your memories of the summers?" or something. And she just lost it and started to cry. And everyone's saying, "What's your problem? We just got this game going here." Well, summers were such a special time for her and her sister. And this was just a stud, as my friend Dave Kennedy, sudden temporary urge of grief. You just caught the person. And she said, this is it. That's my life right now. I've got this big, huge thing I still haven't processed. I'm not smart enough to figure out. It doesn't make sense. And I am very vulnerable. I'm sure Rebecca can talk more about this. This wonderful camp that started up called TMO was for the siblings of those who died of cancer, and it was hosted by Campuchia Gaius with its great interest in cancer and so on. And I thought, this is wonderful. They're recognizing that these kids are different.
Yeah, I think TMO was hugely transformative to just have a community of people who understand what you went through because they went through the same thing. Especially growing up in a small town like Peterborough, nobody else had a sibling who's died. Most people don't even have parents who have died. You are different because of something you can't control. And I don't think it's an intentional ostracization, but your peers see you differently. And fair enough, we don't talk a lot about grief or death in our culture, and they just don't know how to deal with it. And so I think TMO was hugely important to just have a community and build a community of kids who have gone through something similar. And the kids whose siblings passed away 4 or 5 years ago can sort of help along the ones who their sibling just died in the past year, and sort of help them to navigate their grief or explain, like, this is what it's going to be like, and help them figure things out a little bit. I think that community was hugely important to me and to Ben.
Was there a moment, Rebecca, that where in your struggles later on and the challenge of trying to find yourself, of who you were, was there a moment that you can look back on and say that was key, that there was the breakthrough for me that kind of allowed me to see things differently?
I suppose moving away for university was hugely helpful to just have the chance to be my own person, especially because we were so well known in the community with the James Fund and everything that had happened. It felt like my identity was so much connected to James, and more specifically to James's death, that I sort of needed to have an experience where nobody knew my history, nobody knew my backstory. I wasn't James's sister. I wasn't the dead kid's sister. I got to be myself for the first time. And I think that was very important for me.
I remember when you went to Waterloo and you said, "I love being at a big school. I love being a number."
Wow.
But that's powerful.
It's very
And
powerful.
that's incredibly poignant to sort of have that moment, in whether you knew it or not, but after you experience it, to say, I am an individual and I'm not my brother, and I have an identity free and clear of anything else that's happened in my family. Wow, what was that moment like?
It was quite empowering, and sort of for the first time, I guess most teenagers go through it a little bit earlier. It's that, who am I going to be? I sort of experienced all at once. Oh, I get to be my own person. And people are looking at me without seeing the history behind me. And that was really interesting. And I mean, first year university, I don't think I told anybody about James's death or my family history. It was just a clean slate and figuring out who I was outside of all that.
And what's fascinating to me as you're talking, Rebecca, is here you are, your life now is in theater. And Rebecca, you did your MA in Europe and UK in theater, and you are becoming a very well-known actress in this world and somebody who can live multiple characters. And I'm just sitting here wondering, wow, is this kind of part of your development in all of this?
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it is. I'm sure there's a lot of psychoanalysis that could go into that. I've always found it much easier to be a character than to have to be myself. I always got terribly nervous doing public speaking in school, having to make presentations. I'd stand there with my knees shaking, but I've never had stage fright when I act. It's just, there's something about putting on another person that's, maybe it's a mask, or maybe I'm just allowing myself a different kind of freedom. But yeah.
Wow. That's, yeah. That's worthy of a pause.
I know. We're all taking that in.
Yes. Yeah.
Pam, what's different now? Here we are 23 years later. When you think of James, what do you think about now?
I think about what he would look like, what he would be doing. He certainly had an engineering brain. What would he be building? What would he be contributing to society? What I often think, what would our family look like? What would be different? Which is impossible to comprehend. And, we hope that it would still be a place of love and acceptance, which my mantra after all of these years is love is big enough. It's just that simple. Love is big enough. And yeah, we wonder what if, that's always going to be a part of the journey. How tall would he have grown? Would he be balding like some of the family members, or would he have lots of hair like his dad and like Ben? Yeah.
Thank you.
Pam, can you say a little more about that mantra, love is big enough?
Love is big enough. As I mentioned earlier, I like to fix things. I like to sort problems. And I think one of the things that I have learned is to give people space, to walk beside people as they work on their stuff, not try to fix things for them, and just to walk in love with those in our life. And, some days we're more successful than others. We're certainly not perfect. Some things we've done well as a family, and some things we've not done well, and we've, learned. I often say when we screw up the most is when we find out what our next part of our journey to work on is. And when times are tough, you really see clearly what you're doing well and what you're not doing well, and pat yourself on the back for the things you're doing well, and give yourself a kick in the rear end for the things that need some work, and do it from a place of love. The other interesting thing for us as a family was COVID, because we pulled Rebecca out of England on 6 hours notice. Ben had a roommate who was an ICU nurse, and so he ended up back here because he was a caregiver for Syd's brother Tony. And we had some pretty fun times in that first year of COVID as our bubble of four. And it kind of felt like the family life that had been robbed from us due to Rebecca's mental health challenges, Ben's mental health challenges, all of our loads of grief that we were carrying. So we actually had some really fun family times during COVID lockdowns, which was a kind of a big surprise. And we didn't really talk about it a lot because so many people weren't having a good time. And Rebecca and Ben are making Krispy Kreme donuts one day. So it was, that was quite lovely to have sort of that what if answered a little bit. It's like, oh, do you know what? We've always loved each other, but we actually like each other, which was a huge gift.
Yes, for sure. It's been so wonderful to have you just sharing these very, very personal pieces. And I think, the three of us talked about this, and we recognize you are such a unique family, and we don't get to choose, as we all talk about that, things in our life the way we might think, but it seems, and certainly from our conversation here, love has conquered, and love is enough. And I'm sure, that missing James will always be there, never goes away. And as you said, Syd, earlier, it changes, but it doesn't go away. And I think those are important things. Is there any one piece that you would say about grief to people who are listening who may have had a child die, or maybe know somebody who's had a child? Is there just one little short thing you might give them in terms of some advice? Syd, start with you, and then.
Well, the one thing to say is get over it, or you'll get over it. That is an insanely insulting thing to say. So never allow that to happen.
Right. Okay.
Sometimes I've thought of there would be a great book that could be written about the stupid things that people say. We were taking our mandatory, after your kid dies, you go on a family holiday to BC, and someone comes up to and says, "Oh, I know just how you feel. My lawnmower was stolen from my shed last week." Those kind of things. And every grief-stricken person has heard these crazy things. But okay. I would say you can't get over it. You need to find a way to live with this monumental hole in your heart, and you need to rebuild, to reconstruct. You're not trying to fix it. That doesn't work. You got to discover a new way of living your life, and it's so hard. You don't talk about fixing it, because you're going to have a new life, a new way of looking at things forever. You're never going to be able to sit through a board meeting where someone's arguing about, well, I think we should have coffee before, and someone else says, no, it should be. You just don't have time for that anymore. You got to be gone. You can't allow yourself to be in a situation like that. Some of the other advice is you will laugh again. That is guaranteed. You will laugh again. It's not going to be this intense forever, but you will live, laugh there. And I think that's why it's important for people like our family to speak out and to offer hope when you're in the thick of this, in the first year, which is awful, and the second year, which even worse, and maybe 5 years of it. It's not going away in 5 weeks, guys. It's going to be a long time. But you come out of that a changed person, and perhaps you have gifts that you didn't know you have. I've seen so many people who've lost a child who have an awful lot more to give to this world than those who've had plain sailing.
Yeah. Thank you. Rebecca, what would you say to siblings perhaps who have had a brother or sister die?
I think I'd more so say to parents that you can't protect your children from grief, and it's better to model appropriate grieving behavior than to try and shield them from something they will inevitably encounter. I know, just being so connected to the neuroblastoma world, we would hear about some parents who would just tell their kids, oh, little Sally's going on a holiday and won't be back for a very long time. And I think that's so much more damaging. Even as a kid, I was horrified by those stories, because I think building a relationship of honesty with your children is so much more important. And I'm quite lucky that I had parents who did that, who were honest with us and helped us through the difficult feelings instead of trying to protect us from them.
I think a good example of the honesty, Rebecca, was when Mom was diagnosed and there's a tumor in her breast, and it came out as a message. Okay, kids, Mommy's got a bad thing in her boobie. If the doctor does not take it out, she will die. And that was enough. You just tell them. If you have a lie, and you then have to spin another lie the next day, and a third lie, and lies forever, and you just lose the trust of your kids. Yeah. So we were frank and we were open and gave them as much as they could handle and no more than that.
Yeah. And that's a super important point. Pam, what would any final words that you would want to say to people who are experiencing grief like this?
I think that you can't underestimate the weight of the grief and how persistent it is, how heavy it is, and create space in your life for people who will help you carry it. And that can be an ever-expanding thing. And I think that's really important because you can't carry this on your own. It is completely overwhelming if you try to do that. And, you know, there's so many times that I felt that we were carried through this journey. And knowing that those people lifted something very heavy to help us. It wasn't easy. It's not easy to help a family going through the loss of a child. And we are grateful for those people who were brave enough and ballsy enough and kind enough and loving enough. And we are who we are because those people were beside us on the journey. And they didn't try to fix us.
Yeah, that's the key, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, well, and what was occurring to me there, Pam, was like, and it sounds like they kept showing up, right? They kept showing up because we just know, and you know what Syd just spoke to, it's like it goes on and on and on, and yes, it changes, but it doesn't go away. And so I'm imagining is you were carried, you needed to be carried at different times over a long, long, long period of time. So they kept showing up.
Yes. Yes. And in the various communities of your life. And for me, just recently in Ravenna, the morning before the races, we had a team meeting and I thought this was going to be rah-rah. And our coach took a different approach. And he's a 45-year-old man. And this is a team of women over 60. And he said, I'd like you each to share with us who you would like to dedicate this week to. Yeah, it was a very, very, very powerful thing. And I think I was the second last person. And of course, I lost it and showed them my little tattoo on my wrist of James's name, and which is a copy of his writing. And some of them knew my story and some of them didn't. And I was able to share that story. And those people are carrying us and carrying me. And I was carrying them on their journeys, which were some very poignant stories came through. So it continues to expand.
Yep.
And I think the idea of what you've been saying about, you know, here we are, you're at a boat race and the wave hits, right? Yeah. And that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. It just means that the wave hit. Yeah. And those emotions came back. And if, you know, it sounds to me like you gave yourself the space and the people that you were with gave yourself the space. The wave came and then it probably receded and you carried on with your day. But you gave yourself that space just to go, yeah, this is my life. And that's the whole, you know, that I carry with me. As you said, Syd, I carry that with me. And I've just allowed myself to touch that space for a while. And I just needed my space in order to have those feelings. And so many times when people have that, when some time has gone by, they feel like, is there something wrong with me? And it's like, no, you're You need to be kind to yourself as you did and give yourself the space to have those feelings.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much, each of you, for sharing and speaking about this so openly and with open hearts. And I feel so touched. I think you can see, I think we've all been so touched by your words tonight. And I know that our listeners will be too. Before we close, I just do want to turn it back over to each of you. Is there anything that you feel like we haven't said that feels important to be said? I just want to give you one more opportunity before we close.
I think something that I would just briefly say as well to parents who have surviving siblings, I think it's very important. We touched briefly on my brother Ben and I both having quite serious mental health issues in our teens, and most of the other surviving siblings that we know had very similar mental health struggles in their teens. So I think it's important for parents to be on the lookout for that, be mindful of that, create an environment where going to therapy is okay, talking about mental health is okay, and being proactive to take care of mental health is okay. Because we don't have official statistics, but based on the anecdotes we in our family have, the odds aren't great for surviving siblings not having some kind of mental breakdown at some point. So I think it would be helpful for parents and maybe the siblings themselves to know that that could potentially come up in the future, and how to, you can't stop it from happening, but I think you can be proactive in how you take care of your mental health.
Wonderful.
Actually, I think the figure that came out of the UBC study that the James Fund sponsored was 97% will find themselves thinking about suicide, the sort of thing that you and Ben went through. That's a horrific figure to think of. Somehow, when you lose a sibling to, say, a car crash, it's instant. It's frightful, it's terrible. But for the surviving siblings, there's apparently not the same stretched out of over the years you're watching your brother go through treatment and you're number two, not number one, or whatever. It's a shocking figure, and yeah, just be aware of that.
Thank you so much, because we also know, we've had feedback that there's many healthcare providers also who listen to this podcast. And so I also just think that that's important message for all of us. And it makes so much sense.
Yeah.
Yes,
So
and that part of the journey is normal and is okay.
That's
and
right.
We need to, just like the kid who had cancer got to go to treatment, the kid who's got the mental health challenges gets help and gets treatment as well. There's no shame, there's no stigma. It's just the next piece of the journey.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Sometimes when I'm doing parental grief speeches or whatever, especially if I'm doing one of those ones where it's not for the parents, but all their friends who are trying to support them, I'll take a wine glass, a nice crystal wine glass, an expensive one. I'll just smash it into a bucket. Then I'll pour the bucket onto a tray, and you see these millions of shattered pieces. It's not six pieces that you glue together, and there's bits of dust and glass and all. And you look at this, and I say, okay, let's glue that back together. That's what you're wanting this grieving parent to do, is to glue it. And that illustrates how, no, you cannot possibly glue your life together. It's a new life that you've got to figure out.
Thank you. Such a great visual. Thank you for that.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to What Now? On the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. What Now is produced in partnership with Hospice Peterborough, dedicated to providing compassionate care and support to individuals and families facing life-limiting illness and loss. What Now is recorded at Thin Spaces Studio in Peterborough, Ontario. Special thanks to Paradise Garage for providing the music. Technical support is by Sean Heichert, and audio engineering by Kevin Fleming. More episodes of What Now are available for free on most major podcast platforms. If you found value in our conversations, please support us by following the show, leaving a 5-star review, and sharing with your friends and loved ones. If you'd like to support the essential work of Hospice Peterborough, please consider visiting hospicepeterborough.org/donate. Your contribution helps us continue to provide vital care and support. Until next time, may you find peace and comfort on your journey.